Hi there. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time it is. As always, happy whatever day it is, and welcome. I'm Larry Erickson. This is the Erickson Report. And our top story this show is, as it has been, Ukraine. However, this show, I'm not going to be talking about current events there. It's just not possible. Ever since the invasion of Ukraine started on February 24th, it's no way for a show like this, which is on once every 2 weeks, to actually keep up with ongoing events, especially not when you can watch them on various sites, basically minute to minute, watch them live. So it means I have no idea what the situation on the ground is going to be at the time that you're seeing this. So instead, I'm going to be offering some general comments and observations that I think will be useful in the future, no matter what the facts on the ground turn out to be. First, I said last time that if my predictions about events in Ukraine proved to be wrong, that I would own my failure. I would dodge it. The trouble is, right now, I'm not sure how much of a failure I was. See, my prediction was that Russian boss Vladimir Putin would not invade Ukraine unless, and the unless was very important. I referred to an old quote I'd love to be able to source, but unfortunately I can't because I can't remember the source. But the quote was that when presented with a choice between humiliation and war, historically nations have shown a depressingly persistent preference for war. The point being that if in a confrontation, if you don't want to have a war, you have to give the other side a way to back out without appearing to back down. You have to give them a graceful exit, as some have called it, or as I put it, you have to give them a way to back down without appearing to kneel down. This has been widely discussed. It was widely referenced in the run-up to the war. In fact, considerably more than one analyst said we had to find something to give Putin something that he could point to as a victory. In fact, even Adam Smith, the chair of the House Armed Services Committee, said that. And they're still saying it now as a way to try to put an end to the war, even though it's getting harder and harder to figure out what such a thing could be. At the last show, I mentioned a few ideas that had been proposed before the invasion to head it off. One was declaring a moratorium on new members of NATO, kind of a way to finesse the question of Ukraine being in NATO without openly admitting the connection. There was the idea of Ukraine declaring itself neutral, of just we're going to maintain good relations with both sides. Some people suggested that the U.S. and NATO could pressure Ukraine to live up to the commitment it made back in 2015 about allowing for self-rule in the breakaway provinces in southeast Ukraine. And I actually suggested, is my own idea, that doing that, pursuing, allowing the self-rule you already said you would do, plus a passive acknowledgement. There's not a formal statement, not anything formal about it, kind of like, a character in a soap opera who just disappears, go poof, as if from the entire history of the show, because there's a point after which nobody ever just mentions their name again. Sort of like a passive acknowledgement that Crimea is gone, that there is no point in the foreseeable future in which Crimea will ever be a part of Ukraine again. My idea was that those two things, the self-rule plus the passive acknowledgement, would be enough, and that it could give Putin a way to claim a victory about the self-rule. While Ukraine could says, no, nothing's changed, nothing's happened. We're just now, we've already pursuing what we already agreed to about the self-rule. Just negotiations have taken longer than we thought they would. The result in that case would be that neither side had given up anything over which they actually had control at that point, nor did either side gain anything of which they did not already have control at that point. So it seemed to me actually wouldn't be such a bad idea. But I have to interject here to say that one thing that has developed is that U.S. intelligence here was actually pretty good. It accurately described the buildup of forces. It even said that the timetable for an invasion, which the most likely time being between February 20th and March 1st, that timetable proved to be spot on, which is a little hard for some of us to deal with, especially those of us schooled on Indochina and Iraq. We're not used to accurate intelligence, but we need to remember that American intelligence is actually pretty good. It's when that intelligence gets massaged for political purposes that things get screwed up. Just in this case, the intelligence itself did fit the political purpose, so there is no need to massage it, so we got accurate intelligence. Now, what that means is that ultimately, all this means is that it's possible. It is entirely possible that none of the ideas for a graceful exit for Putin would have worked, that we would have wound up in the position where we're already in right now. We don't know if they would have worked or not. What I do know is that they weren't tried. That we did not give Putin, we being the West, did not give Putin a way out. We didn't even try to. Didn't even try to. The policy of the U.S. and NATO could be summed up in 4 words: stand down, no concessions. But that raises another question. Why didn't the U.S. and NATO give him a way out? If the intelligence was as good as it certainly seems to have been, that there was a real prospect for an invasion within a certain time frame, why the unyielding demands? Now, I gave my reasons. Last time I said I could only think of 4 reasons why you would take such an unyielding stance in the light of that situation. And I think events since have proven that I was right in thinking that the third of those alternatives was right, that either they were thinking that there wouldn't be a war, that was all a bluff, and when it came to it, Putin wouldn't pull the trigger, but rather more likely than that, that they figured that they could just bully Putin into just backing down entirely, with the hideous addendum that they apparently probably also believe that if war came, it would be over almost before it started. In fact, some analysts outside the government were openly saying that if a war came, they were predicting the length of that war would be measured in hours, not even in days, much less weeks. And it appears, in fact, that that is exactly what Putin was thinking. Looking at events on the ground since the invasion, analysts have been saying that the strategy looked like it had been based on the premise that an initial barrage of missiles, missile strikes, and a thrust toward Ukraine's capital, plus a rapid seizure of a few key objectives, would bring about the quick collapse of the government of Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky, a government which would either just surrender or flee. Indeed, there is an official Russian statement slated for release on February 26th, which apparently got released accidentally anyway, which reads as though it was intended as a celebration of a victory in Ukraine, indicating Moscow thought the war would be over in less than 2 days. In fact, we can see that expectation early on in this, in the reports from the first day, that the invaders clearly had not made the progress they expected to have made, and more importantly, the reports soon after that of Russian military vehicles being abandoned on the road because they run out of fuel, apparently because they were not expected to have been operating long enough that would be an issue. Plus, now we've got more recent reports of the soldiers running out of food. Because, this is not like some medieval battleground where you carry just your weapons, around your waist or over your shoulder and you walk to wherever you're going to go. And if you run short of food, you just steal it, just seize it from the surrounding countryside. A modern army requires food, fuel, technical and technological support, ammunition, a supply line far more extensive and complex than even a 19th century military engagement. It requires large-scale logistics. And it certainly appears that the Russian attack gave very little thought to that because apparently they thought it was going to be unnecessary. In fact, that expectation of the near immediate collapse may also explain why even now Russian officials can't seem to agree on the purpose of the invasion, on the goal of the invasion. Before the invasion, Putin made claims of genocide against Russians in the breakaway provinces of Luhansk and Donetsk in the Donbass region of southeast Ukraine. There was the claim that the government of Kiev is a drug cartel of neo-Nazis, and that this was about being peacekeepers and denazification and arresting the criminals. Now, the day as I'm doing this, on March 3rd, as a second round of negotiations is starting, apparently now the Russian demand is for demilitarization of Ukraine, plus Ukraine declaring itself neutral and dropping its bid to join NATO. So what happened to the genocide and arresting the neo-Nazi drug lords? And a couple of days ago, on March 1st, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov accused Ukraine of making territorial claims against the Russian Federation and of seeking to obtain nuclear weapons, which, considering the reason Ukraine doesn't have nukes, is that it voluntarily gave them up in 1994 in exchange for security guarantees from the US, the UK, and Russia not to violate the territorial integrity of Ukraine. Maybe that wasn't the wisest thing for Lavrov to bring up. But speaking of nukes, that does bring up something else. On February 27th, Putin said something about putting Russia's deterrence forces, that is, its nuclear weapons, on a special regime of combat duty. The result was a spate of news articles claiming that he had put Russia's nukes in a state of high alert. Well, actually, he didn't. A higher alert state, yes, but high, no. See, Pavel Podvig, a senior researcher with the United Nations Institute for Disarmament Research, described it as, he said, normally under day-to-day status, the system is not capable of transmitting orders to launch nuclear weapons. But he said you can bring it into the status where it is capable, which he said is what had been done. Meanwhile, former Russian military officer Konstantin Eggert told the German news outlet Deutsche Welle that there are 4 levels of alert in the Russian military: regular, heightened, threat of war, and full or complete. You could compare it to the US's DEFCON system for its own nuclear weapons, which has 5 levels, from DEFCON 5 up to DEFCON 1, ranging from what's called fade-out, or day-to-day operations at DEFCON 5, up to cocked pistol at DEFCON 1, where we are or soon will be in a nuclear war. So despite some confusion about what Putin meant, since the term special regime of combat duty is not used by the Russian military, it came down to that there was a move from the regular status to the heightened status, but not to a high status. That, however, does not mean that the threat of nuclear war is not higher than it was a week or 2 ago. But it does mean don't have any sleepless nights over this. At least not yet. The danger of World War III now lies in the question of what happens if Putin essentially, as some are with unnecessary glee predicting, what will happen if Putin essentially outright loses in Ukraine. Not just doesn't get all that he wants, but outright loses, fails, the whole thing collapses. What happens then? You have to realize this is very personal, very emotional with Putin. See, go back to that February 26th statement that read like a celebration of victory in Ukraine. It talked about, and these are all quotes from that statement, it talked about a new world being born before our eyes. Russia is restoring its unity, yes, at a great cost, yes, but there will be no more Ukraine as anti-Russia. Russia is restoring its historical fullness, gathering the Russian world, the Russian people together in its entirety of great Russians, Belarusians, and little Russians, who are the Ukrainians. As for dealing with the West, it said it would be not even Russia, but the Russian world. That is 3 states, Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine, acting in geopolitical terms as a single whole. Even the deaf could hear Russia is returning. This is Russia's return of its historical space and its place in the world. Contrary to some have asserted, Putin's dream is not to reassemble the Soviet Union or the hegemony over Eastern Europe. No, that's not what he's thinking of. He's not thinking back to the 1980s before the dissolution of the Soviet Union. He's not thinking back to the 1960s or the 50s or even the Stalin era of the 30s. He's thinking back to the czars. His dream is that of restoring the old imperial Russia, one of the great empires of history, which at its peak ranged from the border of Poland to the Pacific Ocean and from the Arctic Ocean to the border of Afghanistan. He dreams of going back to the palaces and the glitter and the gilt and the glory of Mother Russia. That's what this is about. That's his dream. So what happens if the result of that, the result of invading Ukraine, is it all blows up in his face? With the military defeat combined with a cratered economy, growing internal unrest and opposition, which I'll mention, by the way, is also spreading to Belarus, and the resulting humiliation in the eyes of much of the world. Would he think then, if I'm going down, if all I dreamed of is turning to ashes, I'm going to take the world down with me? Now, it seems unlikely, it probably is unlikely, but if that happened, could he be restrained by the people around him? Would he be restrained by the people around him? So don't have sleepless nights over this possibility, but yeah, maybe do toss and turn a few times before you sleep. And part of the reason for tossing and turning goes back to the unnecessary glee at the prospect of Putin's defeat that I mentioned. Because something else I raised last time, to which I think events since have given backing and strength, is that there are those in the West, in NATO and in Moscow, who are secretly delighted at recent events because it heralds a return to the good old days of the good old Cold War, with its clear lines and, in the eyes of the various foreign policy establishments, but creepily for the rest of us, its stability. Despite stability, despite all the proxy wars where the Cold War was not very cold for the people actually living there. But it's an attitude reflected in the language of President Biden's State of the Union address, with its references to the situation being all about freedom versus tyranny. Even if we do have people like Viktor Orban on our side, and we have the increasing reports of bigotry and racism in Ukraine directed against people non-white people trying to flee the violence. But it's language that harkens back to the rhetoric of decades ago. So expect, no matter what happens in or to Ukraine, expect years of heightened ongoing tension between the U.S. and Europe on the one side and Russia on the other. And for all you young folks, welcome back to the world your elders grew up in. A world where peace activists knew about alchems and glickums and slickums, knew the difference between MRVs and MIRVs and MARVs, where throwaweights and CEPs were meaningful terms and the advice to duck and cover a source of bitter amusement. Toss and turn indeed. Which makes it relevant to raise this here. The no-fly zone now being pushed by Ukraine is a terrible idea. So terrible there should be actual active pushback. Ukrainian officials, including Zelensky, should be asked what they think would happen if such a zone would be imposed. What would be the result? Do you think that Russia would just go, oh, sorry, we didn't know we weren't supposed to be there, so we'll just leave? And then what would happen when that didn't happen? How do you enforce such a no-fly zone? How do you enforce such a thing? What you're asking for NATO to shoot down Russian jets. You are asking, in fact, for the U.S. and NATO to effectively declare war on Russia. That is what you are asking, and that is insane. And if that means that there are limits to the assistance that the West is going to give to Ukraine, then that's what it means. It's one thing to want NATO to accept the risk of World War III, which it's actually doing now in its support of Ukraine if, in fact, things really do go south for Putin. It's quite another to demand that NATO be the one to start it. I have a few more comments, but we'll take those after the break. And we are back, with a few comments. First up, just very quickly, you may have noticed that the way the capital of Ukraine has been spelled has changed. There's actually a very simple reason for that. The way we learned it in years past, which was Kiev with a short E sound at the end, is actually the way you say it in Russian. Saying it Kiev with a long E sound at the end is how you say it in Ukrainian. So that's it. All right, one last related thing. There's been a great deal of both sympathy for the Ukrainians and for what they're going through, and admiration for the courage and resourcefulness they have shown in resisting the invasion. And both the sympathy and the admiration are well deserved. And yes, we should offer whatever help we can. Now, I have to acknowledge, even though I expect this will not be popular, but I have to acknowledge that I am a pacifist. I cannot approve of military aid, of weapons aid. But I can say yes to humanitarian relief, yes to the acceptance of refugees, and the fact that there are materials and things that can be very useful in terms of nonviolent or at least non-lethal resistance, which can be gotten into Ukraine, airlifted, smuggled, droned, however you get it in. And certainly do that. And I do approve of and support both the social and the economic sanctions being put on Russia, even as I'm aware of the fact that these can result in hardship for Russian citizens who are not part of this, and indeed many of whom have shown their own considerable courage in openly opposing Putin's war, with something approaching 8,000 having gotten arrested so far. And I also want to give a shout out to the amazing Mr. O, aka Barack Obama, who with his statement on the invasion said what most have avoided saying, which is that the economic sanctions on Russia could impact us here. But that is a price we should be willing to pay if we believe our own words. This being said, even as President Biden has said that his red line on sanctions is if they will affect Americans, or perhaps more accurately, his political standing. So the sympathy and the admiration are both deserved, and the assistance is the right thing to do. But that does leave one question still. Why? Why this war? That is, why did this war get the press, the attention, the coverage, the sympathy, the coordinated efforts of great nations? There are at least 4 other wars going on in the world right now that saw somewhere between 10,000 to over 40,000 deaths in 2021, with hundreds to thousands more already in 2022. There are 18 more wars that in 2021 had death tolls ranging from 1,300 to 8,000. Now, I doubt you could recall more than a couple of those 22 wars, and frankly, most of them you probably never even heard of. So why Ukraine? Now, one reason, of course, is the push by major nations because this war involved their interest. But even as that influences, why does it control? So the real question here, actually is not why Ukraine, but why not Myanmar? Why not Yemen, where the U.S. has been involved and continues to be involved through approving of arms sales to Saudi Arabia? Why not Afghanistan, a country of which we appear to have washed our hands so thoroughly, despite a 20-year history of involvement? Most of us could not even tell you what's going on there now. It takes nothing away from the people of Ukraine to say that our concern seems rather selective. And it behooves us, if we can use such an old term as that, it behooves us to consider how much of that difference is because, as David Hannan of UK paper The Telegraph wrote, what makes it so shocking is that they seem so like us. Or as Charlie Diagata of CBS News put it, Kiev is a relatively civilized, relatively European city where you wouldn't expect that. We need to consider that is how much of the difference is because the Ukrainians are white. Now it's true, of course it's true that always there are judgments that have to be made, and that even as rich as we are, as powerful as the U.S. is, even despite all the resources that we have, we can't do everything. We can't cure every ill. We can't relieve every need everywhere. But we could do so much more. In fiscal 2020, which is the most recent data I could find, the U.S. provided something over $39 billion in foreign economic, leaving out military, foreign economic aid, and $13 billion more in humanitarian aid, $52 billion. That is an amount equal to less than 1% of the federal budget and 0.2% of our GDP. It takes nothing away from our desire to assist the innocent in Ukraine to say that we as a nation have been remarkably lacking in our willingness to assist the innocent in places that are not like us. That's it for this week. I'm going to stop right there. I promise, I swear to you and to myself that next week I'm going to try to get back to a more regular show. We will have, I even hope to see the return of some features. Certainly we have the threat, and there are a number of threats that need to be addressed still. But for right now, I'm just going to leave it like that. So instead, I'm just going to say to you, as always, you have the best 2 weeks you possibly can. We'll see you then. And as always, peace.